This talk is happening on the ancestral territories of Indigenous peoples. If we don't know our history, if we cannot trace the past into the present, we cannot explain current conditions in ways that are transformative rather than victim blaming.
Like the courtiers in The Emperor's New Clothes, Westerners are frantically reassuring each other that the Emperor's robes are real and that they're beautiful. Meanwhile, the people who say the Emperor is naked are called liars and hysterics. The 20th century shows what happens to societies that call the ugly beautiful and that call reality a lie. It can happen here, and it is happening. We'll talk about all that and more this week on Disaffected. Welcome to Disaffected. I'm Joshua Slocum. This is the show where we look at politics and culture through a psychological lens with a particular emphasis on abuse dynamics and abuse dynamics that happen in response to or around people who have what are called cluster B personality disorders: borderline, narcissism, histrionic, and psychopathy. And in the second part of this show today, when we go to segment 2, we've actually got an interview with a man named Harrison Coleman, who's a co-host of a podcast called Mind Matters that I highly recommend. And we're going to be talking about a book called Political Ponerology. And that is from the Greek, and it means basically the study of evil. And it was written by a Polish psychologist named Andrew Lovato, who went through communism and Eastern Bloc politics in the mid-20th century and worked with a group of colleagues to come up with a theory to explain why societies tend to go through these paroxysms that often end in totalitarianism and destruction. And what's interesting about this to me is that, you know, this show's hypothesis is that we are living in an era when abuse dynamics that people usually think of in terms of domestic abuse and child abuse are actually structuring our public lives as well. But before we get to that, I want to remind everybody that we do have a website now, Disaffected.fm. And everything you would need from our show is there. All the video is there. All the audio is there. Every place that this podcast shows up, both on video and audio, is clearly linked on Disaffected.fm. So please give a subscribe and give a like on your favorite platform. I want to do a little, I was almost going to say that obnoxious phrase, circling back. Oh, look, I just said it. Also, you'll have to pardon me. We are coming to you this week, not live from a disclosed and stiflingly hot location. So I'm a little bit discombobulated. I managed to mess up everybody's schedules today before we went to record. And because the air conditioner makes noise, I have to turn it off while I'm talking to you. So if I start sweating buckets, it's because it's almost 90 degrees in Vermont and humid. And I absolutely hate summer. So thanks for bearing with me. So you remember... last week, I talked about the dictatorial tone that President Joe Biden was taking about vaccinations, actually giving direct commands to citizens on Twitter, using a tone of voice and a way of speaking that I have never seen an American president do, social media or no. Well, of course, when you elect a president or when a president gets in office by other means, you're not just getting one person, you're getting an entire administration. And as far as I'm concerned, the end game for the Democrats was never Joe Biden anyway. This is how they're going to get Kamala Harris into the White House. So she's putting together a stunning and brave portfolio of being a champion for the people. And this week, she took the same tone. So she says on Twitter, "Shots are free. Get vaccinated." Once again, fuck you. Do you like being spoken to this way? Does this feel comfortable to you? Do you think this is normal? Do you think it's right on, tell them? This is not the way elected officials should be speaking to citizens. We are not vassals of the president or the vice president. That is the political system that we objected to when we founded this country. Joe Biden and Kamala Harris work for us. We do not work for them. I don't know why this is so difficult for people to understand, but the number of people on the left who seem to like this and think it's righteous and want to give her a fist pump really scares me. But, of course, I'm just histrionic and I'm just seeing nightmares where they don't exist. So, we'll see. Next up, we've talked a lot on this show about the increasingly creepy and frankly predatory nature of the contemporary LGBTQ plus phenomenon. We're just miles away from where gay rights activism was when I was actually active in it, most heavily in the 1990s. I remember what it was like for gay people to have to ask for basic equality under the law, when we could be fired from our jobs with no consequence, when we weren't allowed to make a household and share our finances with another partner, to the point where, you know, a gay man or lesbian could spend 20 or 30 years in a committed relationship with a member of the same sex after having been kicked out of the family by the family, only to have their partner's body stolen from them literally at the funeral home because we had no legal right to make someone else our next of kin. And where this movement is today still astonishes me, because I remember how much time we had to spend convincing people that we weren't after their children. We weren't trying to convert children. We weren't trying to groom them so that we could sexually abuse them. That pedophile was not a synonym for homosexual. And you really can't blame people these days if they begin to question whether that's actually true. So here's a picture that I saw on Twitter. You'll remember a few episodes ago when I talked about the Kellogg's Together with Pride cereal box. So it was a box of cereal in a dark purple hue that's usually associated with lesbian and gay political causes. Everything was done in rainbows, the typography and the font, all of the cartoon characters were there, Tony the Tiger, Diggum Frog, etc., etc. And they called it Together with Pride. And it showed a bowl of sugar cereal in rainbow colors. And I called it candy cottaging, and that's what it is. And candy cottaging comes from the folktale of Hansel and Gretel, the witch who put up a candy house so that she could attract lost children, because children like sweets, and once you get them in the door, well, then, of course, you can fatten them up for the kill. And I did not notice this when I talked about this on the prior show, but the top of this box, and I'll describe it for those of you who are listening, the box itself was bad enough, because what do children need to know about alleged LGBTQ politics or political concerns? Why is this a children's concern? I mean, even if you strip out any potential for actual sexual predation, and I don't strip it out, but for the sake of argument, push it aside. This is political. At the very least, it is political grooming of children. This is indoctrination of children. They want to start as young as possible. These are not children's concerns. I'm not saying that children should be shielded from the reality that there are homosexuals and bisexuals in the world. Of course not. And of course, children should be growing up in a society where it's not okay to disenfranchise or bully people because they live their life a way that most people don't live their lives. But that's not what this is about. This is about building social justice warriors from as young an age as possible. So the top of this box, which I missed last time, is just repellent. It's hard to see, but the top flap of the box says, "Lift here to open your heart." Isn't that sweet? Lift here to open your heart. You want to open your heart, don't you? It's not It's not nice to have a closed heart, is it? It's not nice to be exclusive. You want to be inclusive. And underneath lift here to open your heart is my pronouns are, with a space, with a blank space to write in your pronouns, and they helpfully put the slash in there so you can write he, him, or she, her. I was going to say children don't have pronouns. Nobody has pronouns, okay? Nobody has pronouns. You don't own that construction. Your pronouns, that's wrong. Pronouns are what we use when we talk about people in the third person. When we say, when Jane isn't in the room, we say, oh, did you see Jane earlier? She couldn't stay for lunch. That's using pronouns, right? We sometimes use them in conversation when the person is there. But they are not your pronouns. They are a part of language. This is a shared dynamic that we're in here. So nobody has pronouns. You don't have pronouns. So, you can stop telling people what your pronouns are, because that's not real. And you can't make people say things about you when you're not there that they don't want to say. And you shouldn't want to. There's something a little narcissistic and controlling about that, don't you think? And then on to Lego. This is more of the infantilization I was talking about. This is more of the mixing of child concerns with adult concerns. It's not only creepy when it comes to this constant push to get children on board to say that they are LGBTQ plus warriors, but it also is indicative of what I've described before as the extended adolescence that we believe is normal now in this country. We don't think any longer that you are supposed to be an adult at 18 or even 21 or even at 25, when for most people the brain actually finishes its wiring formation at 25. There's a legitimate question to be asked about whether the things that we restrict in law and we reserve only for adults, things like voting, things like driving, things like buying cigarettes, buying alcohol. I'm not a big fan of the nanny state. I'm not a big fan of restrictions, but I do think that, but that doesn't mean that I don't think any of them should exist, right? I mean, I actually don't think children should be able to buy cigarettes. I don't think they should be able to buy alcohol. So I'm not a complete libertarian on that front. But I think there's a reasonable question to ask about why we have arbitrarily picked the age of 18 or 21 when neuroscience tells us that most people aren't actually full-grown adults until they're 25. But even at 25, even if your brain has wired itself up completely, you don't have a lot of life experience behind you. But you should have enough that you can make reasonable adult decisions. And not only do we infantilize adults these days, we make excuses for them when they act like children. We talk about people who are in their 20s or even in their 30s as kids or young people. And I don't think it's just colloquially. It's not just that 70-year-olds say a 25-year-old is a kid. That's very common, right? If you're elderly, a lot of other people look to. It's not just that colloquial usage. We are actually acting as if emotional dysregulation, self-obsession, extreme anxieties about your personal appearance and how other people see you in the world, things that are much more typical of a hormone-ridden 16-year-old, we are excusing in people who are 25, 30, 35 years old. And you see this in the leisure activities that so many chronological adults engage in these days. The dress up, the costume play, the live action role playing that doesn't just happen, once a month on a weekend or a few times. People make a lifestyle out of it, and they put their Harry Potter house in their social media profiles. I mean, this is a children's series about witches and wizards, for goodness sake. And now we've got Lego coming out with its, this is from CNN, first LGBTQ set just ahead of Pride Month. And it is a picture of a bunch of Lego people, and you know what Lego people look like. Well, these ones don't actually have any faces. They don't have any facial features. They don't even have dots of eyes drawn on. That's probably appropriate because we're all being made into drones. So They're all in candy colors, and they're standing on some sort of, I don't even know what you'd call it, but it's a platform that has a back that rises up off of it. And each panel in the background is a different rainbow color. So I don't know if this is supposed to be for children or if it's supposed to be for children who are walking around in adult bodies, but either way, I think it's pretty creepy. And I want to say something, too, about Pride Month. It used to be that there was a particular day of the year that gays and lesbians would celebrate what was called in those days Gay Pride, and we'd have our parade on that day. I don't know how many steps were in between, but we're all the way up to a month now. The month of June, at least in the United States, is wall-to-wall LGBTQ plus nonsense. And I heard somebody the other day talk about it. It seems like it's Pride season again, doesn't it? It does seem to extend all the way throughout the summer. Very, very strange. And finally, let's check back in with our favorite borderlines and histrionics, Sam Smith and Demi Lovato, who I've talked about in recent episodes. Both of them celebrities with more money than they know what to do with, engaged in poor little rich girl and poor little rich boy syndrome. Everything is terribly terrible for them. And of course, Sam Smith is famous not only for his vocal caterwauling that he calls ballads, but also for staging emotional breakdowns at his mansion during lockdown, right when the cameras were there. So pictures of him holding his head in his hand and crying like this. It's just really tough being in lockdown, and it's just awful. And then going on and on about how his issues with his body and how insecure he is this way and that way, and first he's gay and now he's non-binary. And then we've got Demi Lovato, of course, former Disney star, who had a meltdown a few weeks ago on Twitter where she tagged a frozen yogurt shop just owned by a private family in Los Angeles and accused them of triggering anorexics like her with their sugar-free diet foods and taking them to task for making their stores unwelcoming, and talking about how difficult it was for, I think she said she had to struggle to even get in the door. Well, this past week, she stayed on the same path. And, it's been a while since I talked about this, but I'll say it as a reminder. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a psychiatrist. I don't actually have the power to diagnose anybody with any mental ailment. But I do have the power of knowing what I see in front of me and being able to index it against experiences I've had in my life. And both of these people look like very clear cases of trauma disorders resulting in personality pathology. They both display symptoms that are very consistent with borderline personality disorder: identity disturbance, insecurity that turns brittle and reactive very quickly, a tendency to blame other people for feelings of inadequacy that are actually self-generated, and abusing other people on social media or in their lives, blaming them for problems that other people didn't create for them. So last week, Demi Lovato told us that she was very excited to share even more of her personal life with us. Oh my God. She's now non-binary. What is non-binary? I have no idea. I don't feel like a man. I don't feel like a woman. I'm not a man. I'm not a woman. Non-binary. What is non-binary? Non-binary is look at me. That's what it is. Look at me. Look at how special I am. Tell me how special I am. Recognize how special I am by demonstrating it in front of other people. Clap for me. And here's an image from the new single that both of them are on called I'm Ready. They're just so ready for us. They're both standing here. It's a portrait of the two of them in what look like Olympic athletic outfits with what appears to be Olympic-style gold medals hanging around their necks. And they're both standing with their arms on their hips in this confrontational, chin-jutting pose. I mean, you see narcissistic politicians do this. You sometimes see athletes do this when they're, feeling bigged up because they've just won something. But this picture just sums it all up. Look at me. They're posing as winners, right? They're not actually winners. Well, I don't know what they think they're winning. But at one moment, they're crying to the cameras, literally crying, or throwing a fit and being emotionally dysregulated and talking about how hurt they are and how hard everything is for them. And the next minute, they're pumping out crap like this, where they stand there like Teutonic gods, staring off into the distance, jutting their chins out with that defiant narcissistic expression on their faces. This is what borderline personality disorder looks like, folks. Underneath it, I mean, I make fun of these people because they deserve to be made fun of. They're ridiculous. But underneath that, there is real psychological dysfunction. They really are emotionally dysregulated. To some degree, they are experiencing distress. That does not mean that their distress and their lack of emotional regulation, that does not constitute a duty on our part. We don't have to regulate them for them. We don't have to feed their narcissistic demands. That is not a moral obligation that we have just because they might actually be hurting. And that's very characteristic of people with personality disorders. It's not that they don't actually suffer. And even if the suffering they have is self-generated or is a mistaken kind of suffering that they are succouring in themselves, right? Even if there isn't somebody out there who's actually doing something to them, they experience it that way. But they tend to blame other people for it. And if they're not getting enough attention, if their ego isn't being stroked enough, they will either throw a tantrum or they'll create some other socially provocative situation to get other people to react. And often people just react in exasperation and then start making fun of them. And borderlines do this all the time. My mother would do it all the time. If she wasn't getting enough attention, she'd tell another sob story, and then she'd claim that people around her were not being sympathetic. We weren't listening to her pain. We weren't validating her. We weren't agreeing with her. That how she was neglected at somebody else's funeral was the worst insult possible. So that's our check back in with some of our recent topics on the show. We're going to take a break here, and when we come back, we're going to go into an interview with Harrison Coleman of Mind Matters talking about political ponerology. See you on the other side. Would you take just a minute right now and share our show on social media? On Disaffected, we take a close look every week at the abuse dynamics exploding in the dark and disordered world that we live in. Tell other people about us. Want to talk back to us? You're in luck. Call our listener line and leave us a message. 202-979-2480. That's 202-979-2480. And remember, we do reserve the right to play messages on the air. Welcome back. We've got a guest this week. I would like to introduce you to Harrison Coleman, a co-host of the podcast Mind Matters. And on their show, they talk about something called Political Ponerology. And this is the study of evil. And I have been a guest on Mind Matters, and I've been listening to these guys for a few months now. And there's, I think, a very interesting connection to draw between the thesis of this show and the thesis of their show. And what I say when I introduce every episode is that our idea is that abuse dynamics, particularly those that come from personality disorders, including psychopathy, that we usually are more familiar with in domestic situations, partner abuse, spousal abuse, child abuse. These same psychological dynamics live in the political world and the public world as well. And I often say, again, at the beginning of every episode, that it's as if domestic violence has gone feral, but in a way that's not accurate, because it's not as if this is the first time in history in the West where psychopathological thinking and distorted character structure has leaped out of the home and started controlling our political and cultural discourse. So welcome, Harrison. Good to have you.
Great. It's great to be here, Josh. I'm happy to be here.
So just at the beginning, so that people know, give me your description of Mind Matters, what you guys talk on the show, and how would you characterize the idea of political ponerology for the uninitiated?
Well, on Mind Matters, we tend to talk about whatever interests us, which is a lot of things. So we talk about philosophy, psychology, religion, a little bit of politics, current events, but usually from the wider perspective of, from those other fields. So a philosophical perspective, or psychological one, or a ponerological one. So political ponerology comes from the name of a book by Andrew Lovato, who was a Polish psychologist. And the word itself and the book itself was the attempt to essentially create a new field, a new discipline, which would be the scientific study of evil. And evil on every social scale, because Lovato, being Polish, lived during the time of communism in Poland, so from the late 40s till late 80s. And he had the advantage of finishing school in the first year that the communists basically instituted an ideological indoctrination program in the universities. And taking psychology, he had that advantage of having the previous professors and their education before the curriculum essentially was changed over into a totally ideological Marxist framework. So when that happened, he, his colleagues, his professors, in their kind of hushed conversations, realized something about the nature of communism. And well, he doesn't like to even use the word communism because he's going for a generality. He's trying to understand the essence of what it was they were experiencing. There have been several attempts to describe it. One of probably the most popular is totalitarianism, but he called it something else. He called it pathocracy, because what they noticed was something very strange happened to the social fabric of Poland and, well, all of Eastern Europe and all of Russia, the USSR at the time. There seemed to be a complete inversion of the social structure. So what they noticed was that all of these people in power seemed to have personality disorders. That the new class, the new ruling class, had personality disorders, and it became illegal to talk about it. It became illegal to teach about it. So he reminisces in the book about his time at university that last year, and how right away in the libraries, specific books would be removed and not to be seen again. These were books on psychopathology, on personality disorders. They called them, the terminology is a bit confusing because he and his professors at that time called personality disorders either psychopathies or characteropathies. So the distinction he made was,
I like that.
Characteropathy was more of an acquired character defect, either from brain damage or trauma. And nowadays we would probably, like experts in the field would probably categorize all of that as somehow brain related, that even in a traumatic upbringing from a traumatic, with an abusive parent, for instance, that does result in brain damage. And so that brain damage will then affect the thinking, the feeling, and the behavior of the person involved. So, and psychopathy, they would characterize psychopathies in the plural, personality disorders, as the hereditary disorders. So basically a personality structure that is hereditary. Now that doesn't perfectly translate over into the DSM categories, how we think of it in the West. There's a bit of conflation between those categories going on, but I mean that distinction, it's easy enough to think about and to characterize and to understand, I think, even within those categories.
Right. That's interesting because, as a refresher reminder for people listening, what we today call the cluster B personality disorders, they include what's called antisocial, which is just a modern term for psychopathy. And because there is a little bit of confusion about terminology, when I say the word psychopathy, and generally when most people say that today in modern times, they're talking about a personality disorder whose primary characteristic is a complete lack of conscience, a ruthless willingness to exploit other people with no feeling about the effect that that's going to have on them. But the cluster B personality disorders, of course, include psychopathy. They include histrionic personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, and narcissistic personality disorder. And as I've said on the show before, it isn't really clear whether these are 4 discrete diseases or disorders or frames of mind, or whether it's a label for people who are all on this cluster B spectrum, if you will, but have different traits from each. But it's fascinating to me. You said that books in libraries that described psychopathology, described disordered personalities, were just taken out. They just weren't there anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so or go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Well, he ascribes this to what he calls the I can't remember his exact phrase for it, but the kind of preternatural psychological knowledge of the psychopath, that psychopaths lacking conscience, like you observed, like you said, they also seem to have an almost caricature psychologist's knowledge of humanity, and that's like an expert take on human weaknesses and how to manipulate them and how to exploit them. And so they have, he calls it their special psychological knowledge, and so he ascribes it to that psychopaths have from an early age a self-perception, a self-knowledge, a conception of themselves as being different from other people. And you can see this with interviews of diagnosed psychopaths. Like if you read books by Robert Hare or Kent Keel, where they give their snippets of interviews where they're interviews with incarcerated psychopaths, criminal psychopaths, and they'll admit that they've always felt different. They see other people as different. They see normal people as different because they can't comprehend these emotional displays that they see people going through. And they even learn to mimic these displays in order to pass off as human. So
yeah, they wear a human mask, right?
Yeah,
in a sense, don't
mask.
they?
Yep. So that's the well, there's a lot in this book. It was his attempt over decades to describe the political and social system that he and his fellow Poles were living under, and the Hungarians, Czech, everyone in the Eastern Bloc, to understand what was it about this system that made it what it was. Because thinking in terms of sociology or anthropology or just politics, it didn't seem to get to the answer to the question, because there was something unique about what was going on. And the thing that was unique about this was, for him, the psychopathy. Now, in the course of his research and trying to figure out what was going on, he developed a description of, he tried to trace the progression of what he saw as a mass social disease. So, and this is something that happens over decades. So he was trying to trace it from the pre-revolutionary times in Russia through the revolution, through Stalin, and then after World War II with the imposition of the communist system on the Eastern Bloc countries, and then how in those countries there seemed to be the process that had taken place in Russia was kind of telescoped into those 8 to 10 years from the mid 40s till 1950 till the mid 50s after Stalin died. And in those early periods, he argues that in the early periods there's a higher influence by what he would call the characteropathic individuals. So the way I read this, putting it into more modern terminology, is that in the early parts of this process, there is a greater influence by individuals with what we would call borderline personality or paranoid personality disorder or schizoid personality disorder. These are kind of the people that are more active at the beginning of this process.
There's a couple of things I want to pull out there. Very interesting things. The first thing when you said that traditional disciplines like sociology and anthropology couldn't seem to account for this. That I mean, that really rings true for me, because it seems, at least in my view, to connect to a larger problem. And that problem is that people generally, and including academics, outside of people like Lobachevsky, outside of people who actually study psychopathy and personality disorders, there seems to be either a reluctance or a complete lack of knowledge about how individual character and personality pathology exert political power and influence. You often see disciplines like sociology and anthropology describe movements and changes in the political complexion in a society in terms of how a system, not a person, but a disembodied system, is constraining people's choices or offering them certain choices. And it doesn't often seem to account for the personality pathology. And I don't know what your thoughts about this are, but I see that same problem happening today. I see it in terms of people who are either unwilling to stand up and say, I see not just a system that rewards bad behavior, but I see people who commit evil consciously. We don't like to say that. Have you noticed this too?
Yep, absolutely. And it seems to be, I've seen this in several areas. One, even just in the field of psychopathy, where, like, I was reading about psychopathy. I probably started just over 15 years ago, and have been involved in and seen various conversations where people can't even seem to accept the reality of psychopathy. And I don't know.
Too frightening?
Too frightening. Yeah, perhaps. There's probably a whole host of reasons for why a person would not want to accept that, and one seems to be, well, one of them is, I'm not sure how prevalent it is or if it's the main reason, is that people don't seem not to want to believe that not everyone deep down is good or capable capable of some kind of redemption or conscience, because it seems hopeless, I suppose. But all you really have to do is read a book on psychopathy. Read a book on the most psychopathic serial killers, because not all serial killers are psychopathic, but some of them, to get into that mindset where there seems to be a hole somewhere where their humanity should be, and it's just not there. If you look at Israel Keyes or Ted Bundy, there's something that seems inhuman about them, because the things that we consider about ourselves to be most human, those things that we want psychopaths to have, and that perhaps causes a lot of people not to want to believe that psychopathy is a real thing, those things are the very things that are lacking in psychopaths. And I just want to back up a bit and say, tie this to the comment I made about the early stages that Lobachevsky observed about the. So I would say that in those early stages, you'll find more of a prevalence of characteropathy and so paranoid and what he calls frontal characteropathy, which is essentially frontal lobe damage. And we would call it today even just frontal lobe dysfunction, because a lot of people with antisocial personality disorder, a lot of people with borderline personality disorder, they do have dysfunction in their prefrontal cortex. And of course that affects their emotions, their behavior, their decision making. And then, but in the further in the second and later parts of the process, it comes to be increasingly and primarily dominated by actually psychopathic individuals. That was what he was. Yep.
This is fascinating. I'm glad you're going there, because one of the things that I try to get across to people is psychopaths are a problem, but they're not our only problem. And it's never just psychopaths. It's never just the pure conscience-free, most ruthless people. The borderlines, the narcissists, the histrionics, with the paranoids and another personality disorder cluster. Can you give, is there an example of an early stage, whether you would take it from Eastern Europe and communism in the mid-20th century, or even something today? What would be an example of the influence in the early stages of people who may not be full-on psychopaths, but who do have this personality dysfunction?
Sure. Now, it might seem kind of contradictory, but what Lobachevsky says and what he argues is that the characteropathic part, the characteropathic phase, is actually more destructive and more violent than the later ones. So it's actually the later phases that are more characterized by psychopaths actually tend to be less violent and less destructive than the ones in the early stages. So an example of the early stage would be something like the Russian Revolution, the lead up to it, the Russian Revolution itself, and in the 1920s when Lenin, followed by Stalin, took power in the USSR. So these were periods of just massive civil war, violence, torture, cannibalism, rape, the creation of the Cheka, the first secret police, followed by several waves of purges and witch hunts in the USSR. So you had the just mass arrests, ethnic cleansing, mass killing of kulaks and various enemy groups, or that were labeled as enemies. So if you were a landowner, if you were a previous landowner, that could be enough to get you lynched essentially or arrested. Then you have the Stalin purges, probably I think Lobachevsky would probably consider this near the end of that first stage, where previous party members, previous fanatic, true believer members of the Communist Party were then targeted. And this seems to be one of these essential parts of the process that Lobachevsky lays out, is that it is a progressive, as I called it, inversion of the social order. Because one of the ways I tend to describe it is, if you imagine the social order, just a society, as a social network. You've probably seen those visual representations of social networks where you've got a whole bunch of circles and dots connected, and there are different connections connecting different nodes. So if you imagine that's like the social framework. Now, within a normal social framework, you're going to have interspersed within that framework a whole bunch of people with personality disorders. You're going to have the kind of criminal underbelly of society that organize themselves into gangs, mafias, various criminal conspiracies, and you're going to have what you call the family dimension. You're going to have parents and bosses and co-workers, and there's going to be a fairly mixed picture. Now, but within normal society, there are still, because the vast majority of people aren't personality disordered, societies tend to self-organize, and we tend to self-organize in such a way based on merit to a degree. It's never perfect, but when people are hiring for positions, they tend to hire someone who's good for the job. They may find out they're not that good. They may get demoted or fired, etc. And that seems to work in pretty much all areas of life, where people kind of self-fit with the help of others. It's always a mutual process. But society doesn't tend to be run by the criminal element. The criminal element remains an underbelly, and the personality disordered element just remains mixed. I'd say, pretty proportionally. You might have some professions that might have a higher percentage of narcissists or psychopaths or whatever. Like, I think I was reading a paper on the dark triad personalities, Machiavellianism, narcissism, psychopathy, and sadism, the fourth one, and how they did some studies on different professions. Like there's a higher that politicians tend to be more narcissistic, so you'll have a higher percentage of narcissists that will go into politics, et cetera, for different positions. But it's never like you have 100% of any profession or leadership position that is filled with a personality disordered person. We tend to either put the worst of them in prison. Something like, based on Kent Keel's math, something like 93% of criminal psychopaths are involved in the justice system to one degree or another. Either they're in prison or on parole or something like that. So that tends to be the way that a normal human society will structure. What you see in something
it seems to me. I got to jump in. Sorry to cut you off, but I don't want to lose this thought. I'm wondering if it seems to me like we may be in the process of that inversion happening in our society right now, where the and I think of it. I think there's a stage, and I'm not sure, we may be past this stage right now. We may still be in it if what I'm seeing is something real. But it seems to me there's a preparatory stage where people with disordered personalities, personality pathology, begin to influence what we consider to be a normal social structure. So they begin to normalize things that are in fact highly abnormal. And we see this in terms of celebrities who are attacking private citizens because they don't think that the private citizens are standing up for the celebrity's favorite cause as much as they should be. Powerful people, politicians, celebrities, public intellectuals, claiming to be victims of people who don't agree with their ideology or who ask them to justify that ideology. And I see a huge growing resentment being stoked societally against anyone who is labeled as being in the category of privilege. So you were talking a few minutes ago about, looking at in the Soviet Union, landlords, property people, they have to be gotten rid of. We're starting to see the same thing in this country too. This idea that landlords are oppressors who victimize tenants, and that is the primary and only way that we should see that relationship, that people who are not poor, people who have any level of higher education in college are in a privileged position. I think that we are being prepared, and we are being taught to see people who have accomplished something, but who, aside from having accomplished something, could in no normal way be characterized as oppressors or as abusing other people. We are being prepared. We are being taught to see them that way by people with distorted personalities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're correct, and that is the process that we are in and that we are observing. Because the examples that Lobachevsky had when he was writing his book were primarily Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, and then the repeat of the Soviet Union in essentially in these Eastern European countries. So there are probably a whole bunch of different variations that he doesn't get to explicitly in the book, and I think we're witnessing one of those. Of course. Because we're not the process doesn't seem to be, first of all, as violent. Like just obviously, like in the Russian Revolution, there was a violent revolution that became a civil war, and it was extremely bloody. Right. I don't know if that will ever happen. I don't know if it's necessary to happen, because we already have these tendencies in place, these practices in place, where the process is going on behind the scenes, and people are kind of just letting it happen. We are having. I described it once in one of our shows on Mind Matters as I can't remember exactly how I described it, but something like the replacement of our hierarchy of value and our hierarchy of competence, where you see a perfect example of this in the universities with their what's the word for it again? The hiring practices and choosing like acceptance for students. The phrase is just escaping me, where you have to meet quotas. Well, the quota element is essential to this.
Are you talking about things like affirmative action?
Yeah, affirmative action. It just escaped my mind.
Yeah.
But in affirmative action, your targets are now based on categories and characteristics that have nothing to do with what you're actually hiring for. So I'm not looking for the best engineer, right? I need to have 13% black engineers. Now, if your pool for black engineer students is too low, then you're by necessity going to have to widen the pool to include black engineers who are not qualified. And that is essentially a repeat of what happened in the Soviet Union. Not exactly, but it was, we need people with these characteristics. We only have this pool to choose from. Those are the ones we're putting in power. And those are the ones we're putting in all of these important positions. And it's a recipe for disaster.
And there's a connection there. There's a connection there, I think, to, we talk about, I think James Lindsay has used this phrase several times, medical Lecencoism. And for people who are not familiar with Lecencoism in Soviet agriculture, they just basically ignored the factual reality of genetic selection in terms of selective breeding for crop yields and things like that, and just decided that their own ideology about what plants and crops should be like, it was basically a magical framework that they just said, and if we follow this magical framework, we'll have these bountiful crops. And of course, that didn't happen, did it?
It was the exact same thing in Mao's China. If you read Frank Dickhoter's book on the Great Famine, Mao's Great Famine, it was probably an even bigger shit show than in the Soviet Union. The way I was thinking about it when I was reading that book was that every possible thing that they could do wrong, they did do wrong, and they did it with total abandon. Like, they went full energy with the worst policies possible, and it created absolute mayhem and tens of millions of deaths. And this is the problem, like you were saying near the beginning of the interview, of the people who ignore the personality traits of individuals and focus on these systemic things. Well, there are certain systemic things, but all of those systemic characteristics actually trace back to individuals, or at least a lot of them.
Yes, I think so. I think so too. Absolutely. Systems are created by people, and systems influence us, and we influence systems. So there is a chicken and egg question, and we are in some sense in a reciprocal and circular relationship. But there, I think another thing that may happen here is, and you may experience this when you say, hey, this is similar to communism, this is similar to what happens in Nazism, I think that for those of us who are far enough removed historically, there are fewer and fewer of us for whom these massive political upheavals are still in living memory, right? We tend to think that these are singular evils, right? They happened at a specific time. They were absolute aberrations. There was nothing like them ever on the face of the earth before, and there never will be again. So that when you say to people, what I'm trying to show you is that we are walking down the same path that led to communism, that led to National Socialism, they literally think you are crazy, because they think, Nazism only happened in Germany, only happened in World War II, singular evil, not connected to anything else. I find that people are very resistant, and the first thing they go to when you make that connection is they accuse you of being hyperbolic or histrionic. Have you noticed that? Yeah, absolutely. This is the problem of, this gets back to the concept of the mask of sanity, the mask of being a human that psychopaths have. This is something that Lobachevsky's kind of at pains to describe several times in the book, is that communism, Nazism, any other kind of ism that you can find in history where something like this happens, that is the ideological mask of the phenomenon. It's kind of like a psychopath who is a doctor or a lawyer or a traveling salesman. That is essentially what psychopaths need. What you could call this cluster B collective needs is an ideology to hide behind, to use as a Trojan horse. Now, that ideology, no matter what it is, will gain certain characteristics, and it will go through certain processes by virtue of the fact that it is being used by this psychopathic clique. But underneath it, the ideology doesn't really matter. It could be anything. So that's the problem. And I think
woke, yes.
Yeah, wokeness is their current mask of sanity, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's not a very convincing one.
No, well, unfortunately, yeah. Well, I mean, to a lot of people, unfortunately, it is. As we kind of wrap this up and close out this segment, I want to ask you two things. One, what do he and his colleagues say is likely to happen And if we are to take their formulation, their view of this dynamic, what are we in store for? What should we look forward to?
Well, based on his experience, he does talk about this in the book. Whether it happens the same way is impossible to say, but let's just go with it. He basically says that once this process happens and once it's too late, there is a fracturing that takes place in society, because in a totalitarian system, you cannot talk to your neighbor openly without the possibility that you will be penalized, possibly arrested, tortured, possibly killed. And so this has the effect of breaking down the existing social bonds, the social networks, the social relationships that people have. So it is almost a complete fracturing of society and normal social relations. And according to him, it can take decades before those ties are reestablished. What he thinks is that if there were to be a properly scientific kind of education about these topics that was widely enough spread and widely enough accepted, that in itself would have the effect of kind of a psychological immunization, both for people who haven't yet experienced the phenomenon and for those currently living under the phenomenon. And the way he describes it is similar to what you describe in your story, Josh, about was it 2016 when you finally when the phenomenon finally clicked for you. You heard about cluster B, you heard about borderline, and it was like an aha moment where it's like, okay, that makes sense. I understand it now. Lobachevsky says that understanding is an integral part of the psychotherapeutic process, not only for an individual, because these processes, these ponerological processes, these evil dynamics are the same or very similar at all scales, at all social levels. So that dynamic that you had in your personal life, in your family life, in your family relationships, that and the dynamics you went through when discovering what the reality of those relationships was, is the same as what happens on the massive social scale in a totalitarian system. When a person hears what's going on, and has the experience of it, they can then, it's that light bulb moment where it's like, oh, okay, that makes sense. He talks in the book about a woman that a client of his who had been in the Nazi concentration camps, decades earlier, and he explained to her about psychopathies, and then the next week she came back and had written down a list of all the local politicians with her diagnoses of which personality disorders they all had. And so he kind of laughed and said, yep, most of these are correct, but you shouldn't talk about this. Don't tell anyone, hush, hush, because of course.
And that's what I think that's what you're trying to do on your show. That's what I'm trying to do on this show. And that's what I think more people are trying to do is tell people this is real. This is connected, and we can stop it. But stopping it requires us to recognize what we see in front of us and to say out loud that we know it's true. And I thank you for giving us an introduction to this. And I thank you for the work that you're doing on your show. Tell people where they can best find you. Where can they find Mind Matters?
Sure. You can find us on YouTube, on Libry, LBRY. I think it's Odyssey now, actually. That's kind of our backup in case YouTube ever goes upside down. And you can find our podcast, just audio only, at buzzsprout.mindmatters.com and all the major kind of podcast platforms. So if you search Mind Matters on, I think Podbean, Apple, Google Play, all of those venues will have us.
Great. Harrison, thank you very much for your time. Say hi to the rest of the guys on the show. I love listening to you, and we'll have a chance to talk again. Thanks for joining us.
Great. Thank you, Josh. Take care.
Hey, listeners, guess what? We're on Patreon now. Bringing you this show costs money. Would you chip in to help? Go to patreon.com/disaffected. That's patreon.com/DISAFFECTED. Thank you. Welcome back. I told you in the first part of the show that we have a website now, disaffected.fm, and one of the things you can do there is contribute to our show. And if you like what you see here, and I think we do give you an insight into politics and culture that you will not find in most other podcasts, perhaps any other podcast, please support the show. It will help us grow. We have many portals that you can do this through. You can do it through Patreon. You can do it through Subscribestar. You can do it through PayPal. All of those options are listed on disaffected.fm, as are the links to subscribe to our show, particularly on audio. If you are a listener, not somebody who watches on video, take us along in the car. Subscribe on iTunes, subscribe on Pandora, subscribe on Spotify, wherever it is you get that. Obviously, I have an interest in you subscribing because I want you to be alerted when new content comes out, because as the show grows, we will very likely be doing more than just one show a week, and we might be doing some specials and some extras. But I have another interest in it. Every person who subscribes makes this show up better in algorithms. It makes us more attractive to other podcasts. It helps other people to find us. So if you are a regular listener, and I've done this myself, I have a lot of podcasts that I listen to that I realize I've simply forgotten to hit subscribe on. Hit the subscribe button, and if you like it when you're watching it on YouTube, hit the like button too. Thank you. So I want to close out this show talking about, I was going to say, society's inability to see pathology in front of us, but I think it might be more unwillingness to see pathology. This entire show, right? The idea behind this show is that we are in a dangerous time. It's not just that our fashions are changing. It's not just that our social mores are changing. It's that our fundamental moral values are changing, and they're not changing for the better. And the polarization that we have in this country, we hear the word polarization all the time, and we've heard it for 20 or 30 years at least in the mainstream news. We think it's just normal that the U.S. is politically polarized as it is. It's not normal. The fact that people are walking around saying, I realize that I don't have to wear a mask in XYZ situation because I'm not actually in danger, but I'm going to keep it on so that people don't think I'm a Republican. That's not just it's ridiculous, but it's not only and merely ridiculous. It's a danger sign. It's a red flag. That people would consider it a scarlet letter to be seen as a conservative or a Republican, or for a Republican to see it as a scarlet letter that any of his friends might think he has any liberal sympathies. This is dangerous. It's not normal. It's not normal in a healthy society. And even though we have short memories, it didn't used to be this bad even 15 years ago, which is not that long ago. It was not this bad. It was bad, but it is worse now. And I had a couple conversations with friends recently that showed a couple different sides of how this problem either gets acknowledged or doesn't get acknowledged. I was talking with a good friend recently about the show, about the direction I was taking on the show. I don't know how many episodes she's watched, but I said that, the thesis of the show is that the same dynamics that I learned to recognize as cluster B dynamics, personality pathology, in my mother that had structured my domestic life, and in so many unfortunate ways, the ways I behaved in the world and the sorts of friendship and romantic relationships that I engaged in, that I'm now seeing this in the wider world, that domestic abuse is undomesticated, it's feral. And one of her reactions was, she didn't dismiss it out of hand, but I think she's thinking about it. I think she initially disagrees with me, and said that I think she feels that it sounds a little simplistic, or and I don't know if I'm representing her thoughts on this as accurately as I can, but that's kind of what I got out of it. And it reminded me of the ethos that students were inculcated with in liberal arts colleges. I went to Sarah Lawrence College from 1995 to 1999, and it was among the most liberal of the liberal arts colleges. And I took a lot of courses in cultural anthropology and in sociology, a lot of what you call the soft sciences. The soft sciences that today are completely corrupted by woke ideology. At this point, if I had children, I absolutely would not let them go to a school like Sarah Lawrence, Vassar, Bryn Mawr, Smith, anything like that. I think it's a lost cause. I think they're not only not giving a good education, they are literally corrupt. I think academia has been corrupted. I don't know if it can be rescued. But in those days, we were taught to think in complicated and nuanced ways, right? And that sounds okay on the surface. But it led to things like, if you were an anthropology major and you started to look at evolutionary psychology, the branch of psychology that takes evolution seriously and says, just as in animals, we can see that certain behaviors and proclivities were shaped by natural selection over time, so we can also say that this is true of humans because humans are animals too. This is verboten. It was verboten then, and it is even more verboten now. It is called reductionism. The accusation is that you are reducing a complicated, multi-layered, nuanced thing to a stereotyped model or a stereotyped view that is not appropriate. So, you would get pushback, oh, those are the sociobiologists, what they used to call the evolutionary psychologists. They just reduce people down to animal instincts. They just reduce women to baby-making machines, et cetera, et cetera. I'm a reductionist, and I'm not an apologetic reductionist. What you see is what you get. To me, reductionism, reducing things, is about finding patterns, recognizing commonalities, and boiling a situation or a concept down to its component parts, the parts that are common to all the instances of that dynamic. Reductive thinking does need to be balanced by thinking that can perturb it, so to speak, right? It can be easy to get swallowed up by our own models and to forget that there are nuances that complicate these models that we have. I realize that that is true, but there is no interplay between these right now, at least on the liberal side, because you get accused of being reductionist. Well, I don't know what else to say about that, because I do think that humans tend to behave in stereotyped ways. I do think that we learn lessons about how we relate to other people from our parents and from our caregivers, and that we bring those out into the world and we replicate them. And that doesn't mean that society is an exact copy of the nuclear family. But no, I don't think it's crazy to say that we are living in a cluster B world right now. We are having a cultural moment where abuse dynamics that are easier to recognize at home are also structuring our public lives. I don't apologize for that. I don't think I'm a bad reductionist. I don't think I'm looking only in a stereotyped way. I will continue to be accused, of course, of projecting my own experience onto the world. But how far do you want to take that? I mean, I'm sure some of you have had that experience too, right? You say, I was married to a woman who was manipulative in this way, or I was married to a man who beat me, and I recognize these same narcissistic abuse dynamics happening over here. We're less likely to make that accusation against a woman who came out of an abusive relationship. We often, I think more often, are willing to give her credit for being, having picked up on the pattern, that she did notice something, and that her skills that she learned in extracting herself from that relationship are skills that can also be applied on the social level. We seem less willing to do that with people with a past like mine that includes child abuse. I seem to detect that people are more likely to say, well, they're more likely to be rude and flippant. They're likely to say, you have mommy issues, right? And you just see your mother in everything. Okay. So what's behind this, right? Why is it so difficult for people like me, and I'm not the only person like me, there are lots of people out there who are trying to get these ideas across. Why is it so hard for people to accept that we might have actually noticed something real? And I think it's based in fear, and it's emotional. It's not a thought process, it's an emotional process. I want to bring up an image here, again, a tweet, that asks a question that I think everyone should have to answer before they come at somebody and say, you're just making this up, it's not as bad as you think it is. So it doesn't matter who wrote the tweet. The man's name happens to be James Rowe. He's not the first person to say it. But he said, when the newspaper that you read reports men's crimes as women's, you should wonder what else they're lying to you about. Period. End of sentence. Yes. When the New York Times, CNN, the Wall Street Journal, and every other respectable media outlet routinely refers to men as women, when they call Caitlyn Jenner she and her, and they talk about how she won the Olympics in the 70s, you are looking at media that is quite literally lying to you about a fundamental fact that is as obvious to anyone as the sun is obvious when the sun is out. Okay? That's the level of lying here. No. It's not, well, we're doing that to be polite. We're doing that, what did Caitlyn Jenner ever do to you? No, I'm not going to answer that question. That's an evasion. We make choices in our personal lives. These are social fictions, okay? They're social fictions, but transgenderism is not just a social fiction anymore. It's now a legal fiction. We now have an administration that has defined the term sex to mean someone's self-asserted gender identity. We have states like California that have now put male sexual offenders who claim to be women, they're now putting them in the women's prison with women who are physically more vulnerable. This is not a social fiction, and this legal fiction has real world consequences. Honestly, if people were being rational and sane, I wouldn't have to go any farther than to say, why do you expect me to believe anything in the New York Times when they say that men are women? That is a showstopper. Yes, it is. You can't just, I know you might want to write it off, and I know some people watching this are writing it off, but you can't write it off. It's that basic. This is astonishing. And it's not just in social ways. Newspapers are reporting crimes that have been committed by males who claim a transgender identity. They're reporting them as female crimes. I have seen, I was going to say dozens, it's probably in the hundreds now over the past 5 years of both American and UK newspapers describing crimes including assault, actual rape, child molestation, the kinds of violent crimes that statistically men are largely responsible for. And all throughout that, they say she did, the woman did, she did. And sometimes there will even be a picture of the obvious man on there who has a barrette in his hair. And yet, anybody who comments on these articles, their comment is removed for being abusive. This is gaslighting. If the newspapers and the media are willing to do this about actual biological sex, why is it hard to believe that they're not being truthful about the number of coronavirus deaths? Why is it hard to believe that they're not being truthful about the safety and efficacy of the vaccines that we are being ordered by our president and vice president to get? I'm not unreasonable for saying I don't trust the media reports. This is what any sane and rational person would say. So why is there so much pushback against it? For the very same reasons that people don't often like to acknowledge the severity of child abuse, especially child abuse, severe child abuse that's dealt by women, by mothers, because the emotional attachment to the figure of the selfless mother is so strong in us that we are terrified to see anything that might question it. We're absolutely terrified. And so then we emotionally shut down and we start accusing people who are telling the truth of being liars or of being hysterics. I have spent a lot of my life feeling like the mythological figure Cassandra. And the story of Cassandra was that, well, there are several versions of the story, but basically she was punished by the god Apollo. She was cursed to have truthful prophecies, but the curse was that no one would ever believe her. Now, there are a lot of people who believe me about things that I say, right? So I'm not going to go too far with this. But in many ways, I do experience life as if I were a Cassandra. And the kinds of things that I talk about on this show, whether it's about coronavirus, whether it's about transgenderism, whether it's about personality disorders that are very evident to me, but that are held up as examples of loving mother and fatherhood on television. The most common reaction from the general public is, you're exaggerating, you're projecting, it couldn't be as bad as you say it is. I think it is as bad as I say it is, and as some other people say. And I think I'm going to keep talking about it, and I'm going to keep calling it what I think it is. And I'm going to make mistakes. There will be times when I go overboard. But I will note that if you are looked at as a Cassandra, if people treat you as a Cassandra, they remember every mistake you make and they inflate it, and they use it to try to undercut your credibility on other things. These are not standards they hold themselves to. These people could go along and say, oh, no, that's a woman. I mean, it's because they said it was a woman. I mean, they don't hold themselves to these standards. But I had another conversation with a couple of friends of mine who watched the show. Boys, I'm not going to name you because I don't even know if using your first names would be violating your privacy, but I'm not trying to talk about you like you weren't in the room. I know you're watching this. And this was a more gratifying conversation. And these two guys are a couple, one of whom I've been very close to. He's one of my closest friends. I've known him since college. I've known his husband for 10 years now. And he said to me, when we were talking on the phone a few days ago, I want to tell you that you were right. And I said, what was I right about? And he said, you remember when I told you that I thought you were over the top when you talked about people not wanting to get rid of their masks, when I thought that you were exaggerating and over-dramatizing the degree to which people wanted COVID to be an emergency, wanted it to be like the Black Death, weren't going to give up their safety blanket of a mask when the danger is past. He said, you were right. And unnamed good friend of mine, thank you for saying that. It does matter to me. I'm self-confident, but I get a lot of you're exaggerating, and I get very little you were right. So that means something to me. But I bring this up because I want people to understand the stakes here. One of the ways that abuse dynamics and cults of personality and narcissistic movements like Black Lives Matter, like the Modern Transgender Project, like most of the liberal left these days, trying to seize control of voting systems, of trying to scuttle any state laws that require a basic ID by proposing that requiring black people to actually go to the DMV and get a driver's license or a non-driver's ID is somehow racism. I mean, the very fact that this political party does not want citizens to have to meet even the barest test of authenticity ought to tell you something about the kind of voters they want and the kind of votes they want to get. We've got to face this. But these systems, they undercut the credibility of critics by saying that critics are crazy, by saying that they have a personal problem, that they have, that they're exaggerating, that they're just doing it for attention. And they play on the emotions that most of us carry with us. Most of us, and I've said this before about personality disorders, some people have a hard time accepting even that personality disorders are real. They cannot, and Harrison said that in our last segment, they can't accept that there are people who are walking around who do not have a conscience, people who are bad, people who don't care at all, not even a little bit when they hurt someone. Not only do they not care, they might actually get satisfaction from it. They don't want to believe this is true. If you know people like this, these people are very vulnerable to predation because they close their eyes and they say, it's not true, it's not true, it's not true. And One other thing I want to say about this, and to wrap this up, so much mental health is being destroyed by the way we've lived for the past year in this country, the way we've treated a virus that was not nearly as bad as the Black Death as if it were the Black Death. We've upended our economy. Hundreds of thousands of businesses have closed their doors. Around here in Burlington, Vermont, you cannot get help at a restaurant. Even chain restaurants that I do delivery for, it's not uncommon to walk up to the door and see a sign at 5 o'clock in the evening saying, sorry, we don't have any staff, we couldn't open. Our economy is in tatters. And and people say it isn't true. We are also going to pay the price for what this has done to people psychologically in terms of anxiety and hypochondria. The theater over masks, the ever-changing requirements, the sense of danger that our elected officials, the CDC, and the media have actively stoked every single day has had real-world consequences. I see it in my daily life. I've told you before I've complained because I find it irksome, but I'll not complain about it this time. I'll talk about what might actually be going on. Those people who walk past me on the street when I'm the only maskless person and they flatten themselves up against the wall, or they go out of their way, they walk into the road not to have to walk past me. Yeah, I think some of them are being purely performative, but I think some of them are actually scared. That's not normal. A couple of weeks ago, I did a delivery to a house with a bunch of apartments in it, doing food delivery. And the delivery service I work for gives you instructions in the app. It tells you whether the customer wants you to knock on the door and hand it to them, or whether the customer wants you to leave it at their doorstep and just say, hi, your food is here. So this delivery said, customer wants you to hand the order. Walk up to the door, knock on the door, and I see a young college-age woman walking toward me, and she's got this really quizzical look on her face. Like she can't understand what I'm trying. I'm holding a food delivery bag, but she's got a look on her face like this, right? And so I thought, oh God, here we go. So I said, oh, if you want me to leave it, I'm happy to leave it. I'm just following the instructions. It said knock on the door, and she's gesturing to me, put it down, put it down, put it down. So I'm thinking to myself, okay, I'm not even going to keep speaking. It's clearly provocative to this young woman that I'm even talking to her. So I put the food down, and I'm walking off her porch, going back to my car, which is about 40 feet away. And I can see her standing behind her glass screen door. She's standing there looking at me. I walk off the porch. She won't open the door still. She's still watching me walk away. I go all the way over to my car. I get inside, and I can see her. She still won't open her door. I get inside my car, and I close the door, and it was only after I'd closed the door in my car that she opened up the door, kept her head behind the glass door, reached out, got the bag like this, pulled it back in, and quickly closed the door. That's severe hypochondria at the very least. And it's not the only instance I've seen. Because it's been made normal to be hysterical about other people, about masks, to treat other people as if they were likely sources of contagion and death to you. This has hidden mental illness right in front of us. There is an epidemic of hypochondria and obsessive-compulsive disorder that's going on right now that is being normalized because everyone thinks it's normal to act like we're in plague times. It isn't normal. Not everybody is this bad, but I'm seeing far more of it in public than I've ever seen before. And that damage is going to last. And I worry about what's going to happen to people because I don't even know if anyone yet recognizes that this behavior is actual medical hypochondria, and that for some people, perhaps latent obsessive compulsive disorder has reared its head again, because OCD is one of my diagnoses. Thankfully, most of the time I'm free of it anymore. Under high stress, it can come back to me. But at bottom, OCD is an anxiety disorder, and it can certainly take the form of having that sort of anxiety about your health. So that's this week's show. Thank you for joining us. And we'll come back to you next week with something else fresh and exciting, and probably something irritating too. Take care, folks. Would you take just a minute right now and share our show on social media? On Disaffected, we take a close look every week at the abuse dynamics exploding in the dark and disordered world that we live in. Tell other people about us. Hey, listeners, guess what? We're on Patreon now. Bringing you this show costs money. Would you chip in to help? Go to patreon.com/disaffected. That's patreon.com/DISAFFECTED. Thank you.